my name is Elina Tapio, and in this video I'm going to talk about multimodal interaction, interactional skills for enabling equality and participation.